settling Guinness. That's racial reconciliation happening right there.
Black is beautiful. Oh, you're so right. That boy's got nice legs, eh?
What one?
That boy, David.
It does not. They say do not awaken love before its time.
Smile on everybody's face. Who's still coming? Over. We're all relaxed from the bus.
The guy feels something on his soul.
So the civil rights movement exploded. It was inspired by the civil rights movement in America, obviously, with Martin Luther King and other organisations. And in 1968, right across the world, there was a wave of uprising. They wanted equality, which was the bottom line, and they didn't achieve it. For example, and you said about how they didn't know that Peter Ward was a Catholic. A Catholic. My parents, for example, when they would go for jobs, and the discrimination was that blatant, when they went for jobs, they would ask what their name was. Now, Catholic names would be slightly different Protestant names, and you can tell. But if you had an example where they couldn't tell from your name, then they would ask you where you lived. So if they couldn't tell from where you lived, they would ask what school you went to. And a lot of Catholic schools are named after saints. So if I said, for example, that I went to St. Mary's, you know, they would straight away know that I was a Catholic. So the civil rights exploded then, and it really challenged the status quo here. Over 1,000 families were forced to flee their homes. People didn't feel that they were protected, they felt isolated, and people who were Republicans took that lesson on board, and what started to develop is through the spark of the civil rights that people started to think, well, you know, we need to defend our areas. So the IRA initially came about in this phase of the conflict as a defensive force, not an offensive force.
But then when the IRA decided that they were going to come on the scene, they could see obviously that the civil rights were getting nowhere, they were hammered, and of course they took the view that the only way to sort of solve this is through violence, you know.
And I know one particularly notorious IRA mass killer, and this is a very disturbing thing about the job. It was very difficult to dislike. He's a nice person, and he murdered at least 5 people. That's what they caught him for, you know.
I thought that everybody in my school, everybody in Northern Ireland were generally Protestants. I didn't realise it was segregated. My friends were generally Protestant as well. I think the way you're brought up is you go to a certain school and you generally mix with a certain crowd, and unfortunately that is segregated into Protestants and Catholics. The main thing for me and the main turning point for my life was I actually competed in athletics. And I ran for Great Britain and Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. And through athletics, I actually got involved with a lot of competitions where I was actually introduced to Catholics for the first time. There aren't people who are blue with pink spots, they're actually people that look exactly like you. And a lot of the times I used to think I'll be able to spot a Catholic, I'll be able to spot a Protestant. I couldn't spot one from the other, and that was a big insight for me, because growing up I was only ever introduced to Protestants, so to meet Catholics and think they're actually no different than me was a big thing. One of the experiences I had actually, there was a young girl, we were about 13, and she became very good friends of mine, and her name was Kirsten Kravetsky, and she lived with her mum and her sister in a Protestant estate, but they were predominantly Catholic. And one day at athletics, one afternoon, she didn't turn up for practice, and I said to my coach, I said, "Where's Kirsten?" She didn't know where she was. I went round to her house later on after athletics, and as I got closer to her house, I seen smoke coming, and it looked like her house had been on fire, but had been put out. And I later realised that her house was actually burnt down by paramilitaries who wanted her and her mum and her sister out of the estate that she lived in. They hadn't done anything to anybody, they never did. They kept themselves to themselves. Thankfully, what actually happened was they petrol bombed her house in the middle of the night. Her and her sister were sleeping. Her mum heard the noise and was able to evacuate her 2 children out of the house safely. And that just made me think, you know, why would someone want to do this to 2 innocent children?
Because so many of the events were the same. Guy shot dead for being a Catholic Tuesday. Guy shot dead for being a Protestant Wednesday. 2 guys shot dead for being a Catholic Thursday.
Notice the AK-47 sticking out of the old woman's shopping bag, you know. So we'll move on.
How on earth do you not shed a tear when 3 children under 9 burned to death, and you know that the people who were trying to save them, and they were attacked because they were Catholics and for no other reason, when you know one of the people trying to save them heard the youngest shout out, "Mammy, my feet are on fire." Now you try being objective after that. I couldn't do it. And I mean, I never forget covering that funeral. 3 coffins that size. Can you imagine?
It's sort of strange idea that, you know, I'm standing in a war zone at the moment, and a war zone that is, you know, tempered to a large degree, but it's sort of makes me appreciate the precarious nature of peace.
Yes.
As you stand in a place that was absent peace.
Only the other day, while you guys were probably airborne, one of the worst atrocities in Northern Ireland's history was the bombing of a pub called McGurk's Bar. The first real, you know, loads of people killed in one incident. And the British Army said it was an IRA bomb passing it, which had gone off prematurely. No such thing. It was a loyalist paramilitary deliberate attack to kill Catholics simply because they were Catholics. And only this week, a British minister has apologised for what the British Army said in 1971.
Can you explain a little bit, especially for people that don't know much about it?
Druncree 95, that was.
Yeah.
I was just there was lines of British soldiers stopping. British soldiers and the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which was the police force as then, now reformed as the Police Service in Northern Ireland. Were trying to block Orange men from marching down the Garvackie Road in Portadown. And for 3 days, there was blast bombs, petrol bombs, verbal abuse, all the horrible things that could happen. And for 3 days, they allowed it to happen. And on 12 o'clock, the night before the 12th, a decision was made, wherever, I'm presuming in Whitehall, in Westminster, to allow the Orange men to march. And essentially all the security forces were ordered to turn around and protect the very men that had been assaulting him for the last 3 days. That's quite angering. That's quite angering that someone would cave in. Why? Even beyond the moral implications that I'm a person who doesn't believe that has certain issues with the Orange Order, and also certain and definite issues with them continuing to march in nationalist areas because of the triumphalist or the element of the provocative element of the marches, particularly the bands, doing that. Just on another level altogether, why put someone through, or why do all that hard work and then at the last minute pull back? And I just could never understand it, and it was a moment that I just thought was stupidity. And I think it highlights the absolute inconsistency of the British military and the British political approach to Northern Ireland, and the way that they'd caved to unionist demands on so many occasions at the expense of the nationalist stroke Republican community. And in that instance, it made me angry, very angry, and that was pretty much towards the end of my military career, so that tells you everything about what that incident meant for me.
My name's Gerard Diver. I'm the Mayor of Derry. I'm an SDLP councillor here in the city. Prior to 1969, we had a much more mixed picture. The West Bank was always predominantly nationalist, but you had a significant unionist population here as well, and for whatever reason people felt the need to move from one side of the river to the other because of the conflict. There were some very practical reasons for that around people from the unionist community. Many of them would have been people that would have been involved in the security forces, been involved in the police, prison service, government jobs where there would have been quite a real risk to their personal safety, and many of them were assassinated in this city.
In 1968 was the beginning of the Troubles. There was over 20,000 Protestants living here in the West Bank before 1968. It's down now to under 300, it's down now to under 800 in the whole of the West Bank here. Me being a Protestant, it took me a lot of years to come to terms with that. The one thing about Troubles is once it starts, it's how to stop it.
And this is an example of the rubber bullet. And then these at some point were deemed to be too dangerous and banned, and they've been replaced with plastic bullets. And plastic bullets are actually still legal to fire them. Now, they're designed to be non-lethal and only to stop rioters or whatever. But over the period of the Troubles, these between them have killed 17 people and injured, seriously injured, numerous others.
So I was first elected to the council in June 2001, and I represent the other side of the water, what we call the water side, which is a more mixed area of the city. And at that time I lived in an area which would have been predominantly unionist and Protestant. And 4 months into my time as councillor, somebody decided to come to my home with a bomb and basically blew the front of my house away. It was a very, very close thing, a very close call. It was a device called a pipe bomb, which I don't know whether people are familiar with, but these are basically very crude grenades, a piece of copper pipe filled with cordite, and the nice folk that put them together score the outside of them so that they fragment into shrapnel to cause the maximum amount of damage, and they strap things to them as well, razor blades and nails and various things. But anyway, it was a very close call. This device went off, it partially exploded inside my house, and literally a few feet would have made a great deal of difference. Thankfully, my wife, my children, myself were not injured, but it certainly gave me a very dark insight to what being involved in politics in Northern Ireland could mean. And this is only, whatever, 7 years ago.
Because what happened here, if you think about it, we didn't come out of conflict like that. You had the 94 ceasefire by the Provos, that collapsed in 96. Then it's restored. Nobody really believes it's permanent. Then you have the Good Friday Agreement and all the difficulties in that roller coaster post-Good Friday.
Although the Troubles ended in 1998 with the Good Friday Agreement, unrest persists, as signified by the parade violence earlier this month. The Troubles began with protests for equality, but ended with hopes brewing within the hearts of the evolving Irish community for liberation from British rule.
Ultimately, you've got two irreconcilable aims, objectives. The SDLP may have made it today, Sinn Féin certainly the same. Ultimately, their objective is a united Ireland. And ultimately, the objective of the DUP and the Ulster Unionist Party is to retain the link with Great Britain. And it's irreconcilable.
All conflict is about what? It's about difference. Whether it's difference of race, difference of religion, or difference of nationality. But difference is an accident of birth, therefore it's not something anyone should fight about. It's something that should be respected.
Obviously, reconciliation is an abstract concept, and it's quite slippery. You can't touch it as such. But one of the signs, I think, one of the important signs that reconciliation may be happening is when people stop shooting each other.
Reconciliation is far from being an end to hostilities. Reconciliation is basically something that Galtung called positive peace. And positive peace is when all kinds of violence, ends. not only physical violence, but also structural violence, which means equality. When social equality and human rights prevails, that's when really you have reconciliation.
For me, it's a very personal thing where two enemies can sit down at a table and talk without wanting to come to blows.
Over the years, the relationships between our two communities will improve. It's already improving, because the more they work together and spill their sweat and not their blood, the more they break down the barriers of the past, and a new society will evolve.
Well, I was travelling in a taxi back from Derry Town Centre. I was chatting to the taxi driver who asked us about why we're here, because I was with Babs, and it's an unusual combination to have a Zimbabwean and an Englishman travelling through Derry, so it prompted the question, why are you here? And I explained to him about the Trentlock Leadership Initiative, and then went on to tell him that I was going through the process of gaining Irish citizenship. When he asked me about why, I replied to him that I was doing it because of, it was a symbol of my shame of what the British government and what the British Army did here. He turned to me and he said, I'm only the second British person he's ever heard say that point of view. And at that point I decided to take a chance, and I told him that I'm also a former soldier. His reaction was amazing, because he turned to me and then he took a chance. He told me that he's a former 3-time prisoner and Republican, member of the IRA, and he thought what I was doing was amazing, and he hopes that our paths will cross again. Later on I'm going to go down and see if I can find him and pass on my details. But it was quite an amazing moment for me that I could admit that, and he could admit that we felt secure enough with each other in order to admit that.
And do you think even 10 years ago you could have had that conversation?
No.
But we'll look at it earlier, but we're talking about kind of the sectarian element of the conflict here. For this graveyard, there's Catholics buried in it as well. It's now mostly the Catholic. But this entrance here was actually the Protestant entrance. Only Protestants were allowed to use this. And as we go further on up the road, you'll actually see the Catholic entrance. But part of this graveyard as well, there's a piece of ground where the Protestants in death wanted to be segregated from Catholics, and they actually built a 7-foot wall underground so that they were segregated in death, and that's actually a fact.
Some people have this utopian ideal of reconciliation, and we should all be striving for that. It's not an excuse not to strive for it, but there's reconciliation happening every day. I was on a walking tour of West Belfast today, where I went into Milltown Cemetery. That couldn't have happened 10 years ago. You know, because I'm a former British soldier, I could have gone there in secret, but I wouldn't have gone there because I would have been too scared to go there.